vBrownbag US edition. Today is Wednesday, February the 11th, 2015, and we're going to be talking with Brian Ragazzi about using custom properties within vRealize automation. So my name is Damian Carlson. I'm at 6footDad. I'll be your host tonight. I haven't been on the show in a while, so this is kind of cool. And it's especially cool to host with my friend Brian. If you're new to the show, or if you've forgotten since you last listened to us or attended live, you can follow us at vBrownbag. You can follow our Latin American edition of the podcast at vBrownbag, LATAM, and our EMEA version at vBrownbag, EMEA, E-M-E-A. The Twitter hashtag is vBrownbag, and that's where all of our vBrownbag discussions go on. So if you do tweet, feel free to add that hashtag to it. You can find all of our podcast properties around the world at professionalvmware.com/brownbags. And you know what? I totally didn't start showing my screen because apparently I've never podcasted before in my entire life, so feel free to point and laugh along at home or in your car. You should be able to see it now. Yay, I'm like a veritable Josh Atwell over here. I bet a mod is way better at this than I am. So, again, this is Damian Carlson at 6footDad. Our host is Brian Ragazzi at Brian Ragazzi, which is a pretty creative one there, Brian. And he'll be talking about custom properties within vRealize automation. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to the presenter, and you should be good to go, Brian.
All right.
All right. You have the helm.
All right, fantastic. Let's see if this works. All right, is that showing up?
Indeed it is. I see your PowerPoint.
Fantastic. Excellent. All right, so I'm Brian Ragazzi. I'm proud to work with Damian, and what we're talking about today is using some of the custom properties in vRealize automation. I'll try to remember to call it vRealize automation, although you may catch me from time to time calling it VCAC or something along those lines. So we'll dive right in. Just a quick background on the custom properties in the system. They're typically used like tags. There's a great many that are already predefined by VMware. The system knows how to handle, knows what to do with. Those are all enumerated in the custom properties reference guide that they provide for VCAC and vRealize automation. But one of the things that makes them really fantastic is that you can add your own, and you can name them pretty much however you see fit. Typically, you're going to want to name them based on, give them some sort of a descriptive name and name them from general to more specific. One thing to realize, though, of course, is that for everything that you do create that doesn't already come in the custom properties reference, you'll have to add some sort of handler for it. So if you create a new custom property named, virtual machine that do really cool stuff, if there's not a handler out there that knows what to do when you set the do really cool stuff property, it's not going to do anything interesting. So with that, I've got a couple of use cases I want to walk through and how we would use these to really make VCAC or vRealize match our business needs. But I want to kind of level set where we need to be before we get started. So we're going to make the assumptions that you've already installed VCAC 6.1 or 6.0 or vRealize Automation 6.2. We're going to assume that you've got a couple of infrastructure as a service blueprints already created, and you know that those work. You're able to provision those. You've done your business groups already, and you've got a handful of network profiles created. The use cases that we plan to walk through are three that I think we've run into a few times now that we've done the system here, and we'll kind of get you a good foothold on how to branch out from here once you understand these. The first, of course, we're going to select the VM size. This is pretty common Organizations don't want their users standing up machines of an arbitrary size. We want to make sure that it complies with some sort of standard, and we set a number of properties all in one shot. The second use case here is we want to select a network. You've already found that if you've been playing with the system a little bit, that when you grant a reservation that has multiple network profiles, that VCAC or vRealize automation will just round robin between the network profiles and deposit your provisioned VMs wherever it sees fit. And you want to make sure that you put those in the right place. The simple network selection there will give the same list to all of your users from that blueprint, and the complex is a little more involved where you say based on a given business group, we want to only show certain, only make certain networks available. So here are in our first use case. Again, like we talked about here, we want to, what we're shooting for here is to keep users from creating arbitrarily sized VMs. Perhaps we're concerned about adjusting the slot size out of control in our cluster, or we just want to make sure that everything remains the same. And we really don't want to have to create a wide variety of infrastructure as a service blueprints. All right, so one of the things that we'll need when we get started is we'll need some idea of what our standards are. Now, I don't have a ton of resources in my lab, so this is what I used. It's pretty small by most people's standards, but at least you'll know what to recognize when we get to it later. You'll want to talk to your or consult with your IT business policies and so on to determine what makes sense for your organization for what those standards need to be. What is small to you, maybe large to somebody else, and so on. And again, you may find that you're in a situation where you need a lot more granularity. I need to be able to create an extra small or an extra large or an extra medium. I don't know. But whatever fits for you, you may come up with those, and you'll see how to do that in the use case here. So getting started, the first thing we're going to do is create our property dictionary. Sometimes the system will call it a property definition. I try to call it a dictionary, but it can go either way. We're going to make one up called virtualmachine.size. And again, like we talked about earlier, we're going to make one up, but we need to make sure that we handle it later. When you create your property dictionary, you're able to select a control type. That control type can be a number of different choices there, but you'll see that there's a drop-down and there's a drop-down list. The behavior looks to be the same until you realize that if you choose drop-down, that a user can enter whatever they want to in there. And so once they're allowed to do that, they can enter a value that you wouldn't be able to handle or have the handler written for. So the drop-down list will limit the user to only the selections that you provide. And because we want to make sure that they enter a value in there, we're going to set that that property dictionary custom property to be required. The other piece that we're going to add to our property dictionary are the attributes for it. Here you'll see that we've added a value list and help text. The value list is, of course, what shows up on that drop-down list for the users. Just like we talked about earlier, we're going to have a small, medium, and large. Help text is really just kind of a text box that pops up for the user to tell them a little bit about what it is that they're making a choice on. It doesn't really give you a lot of formatting options. And you can see I tried to cram a lot of information into here, and it doesn't show up quite as pretty as you would hope, but at least it gives somebody something to go on. Once we've defined our property dictionary and we've set attributes on it, then we want to create a build profile that makes use of these properties that we've added, and we include some of the other ones that we're going to be manipulating later in our workflow. So within our build profile, we're going to create this one. We're going to call it virtual machine.selected size. We're going to add, of course, the virtual machine.size property. We're going to make sure that that one is set to prompt user so that they're able to select from the drop-down. We also make sure that we fire the external stub workflow for building machine, and we're going to modify that in just a moment. But by including it here, it makes sure that it gets executed. In addition, we're going to create a property called doSize. This way we can make sure that we look for the do size property in our workflow and execute what we need it to do if that is set to true. This gives us the opportunity to also not run through that piece of the workflow if it's not appropriate in a later blueprint. And then some of the pieces that we'll be changing within the workflow are the CPU.count, memory.size, disk1.size, and disk1 label. So we're going to make sure that we include those in the build profile as well. This way those get marked as properties of the provisioning workflow, and then they can be manipulated. All right, before we get into the modification of the workflow, we're going to want to make sure that we modify the blueprints to use them. So in this case, the ones that we're going to be adding our build profile to, we're going to remove the ability for the user to choose an arbitrary number of CPUs and the memory size and so on, and then remove from them also the ability to see and change the reservation policies. So this really only will allow them to see what we've configured for the default minimum values, and then also allow them to choose later the size that they want applied. You'll notice down below that we've set the maximum volumes to 2. This way we can ensure that when we add the second one to it, there won't be any kind of problems later. Now, the other piece that we're going to do with the blueprints is, of course, make sure that we add to it our virtual machine that select size build profile. That's in the Properties tab of the blueprint. We'll select that option. Now here we are. We've made a lot of changes to the property dictionary, the attributes, the build profile, the blueprints. But if we stop here, the user will get the choice. They will actually see the drop down. They'll be able to choose an option there, but the system will completely ignore it. So to make that actually, to round it out, we're going to have to modify the stub workflow, and that's the next piece. So we're going to modify the stub workflow, building machine. We're going to use the VCAC Designer. Now, despite the product being named vRealize Automation, this particular tool is still called the VCAC Designer. The designer, some people have had a couple of issues running it. You need to make sure that the user that you're running it as is a member of the infrastructure administrator's role. And that the machine that you're running it on also trusts the infrastructure as a service server SSL certificate. If you find that when you launch it, it looks like it's going to come up and it completely goes away, or if you try to, you'll find that when you try to run it from the command prompt, you get a little more information that will indicate that the SSL certificate is not trusted. You can work around that in a lot of cases by just running the designer on your infrastructure as a service server as well. So we've launched the VCAC Designer, and we're going to load the building machine workflow. Within there, we're going to navigate into the custom code section. If you haven't used this tool before, you'll find that that does leave you a lot of real estate in the middle of the screen to actually work in. There's a large banner at the top and pieces all over, but after I get done griping about it, we can usually get things done. So there are several slides I've got here on actually building this workflow, and I kind of want to walk through one of these scenarios and all the pieces that are involved. But if you choose to tune out, I understand, and I'll provide the exported XAML file and import instructions so that you can kind of shortcut some of this later. But what we're going to do is we're going to look for the do size, the virtual machine.do size property that we set earlier in our build profile. So we create a variable called do size, and we load a get machine property action that will write the value in the virtual machine.do size property to that variable. Then we're going to add an if then statement that, as you can see, will evaluate the do size value. Just in case I don't remember later to set everything to lowercase, we're going to evaluate that in specifically in lowercase. So if the do size value is true all lowercase, then we'll know to execute the then side of the if then statement. You can see we're not going to add anything to the else side of it, so that we'll only actually do something if it's set to true in lowercase. We're going to add a flow chart into then. We're going to call it alter size, And that flowchart is going to contain a little more logic that says to retrieve from the blueprint, from the executed provisioning workflow, the virtual machine.size property. That's the value of the dropdown that the user selected. We're going to store that in a size selected variable. We're going to add a switch into here, which we'll get into in just a moment, that will of course have some logic on which workflow to follow based on the value of the size selected variable. And then lastly, we're going to add a save changes action, so those changes are saved back to the repository after we alter the properties. So let's modify the set medium. Did I skip one? Sorry. Yeah, within the switch piece, we add a set medium workflow that allows us to set the various properties. So we're going to add 4 set machine property actions. You can see they're labeled there: set CPU count, memory size, disk one size, and label. And on here you can also see that we're going to set the property name based on the value. So here's where it comes into play, the standards that we defined earlier, what those are for medium in this case, 2 CPUs, 2 gigs of RAM, and the disk one, and so on. We set those in here. We can copy this workflow then to the medium, from medium to the small and large activity areas and make those modifications. So again, those properties that we set earlier or determined earlier for our sizes, 1 CPU, 1 gig of RAM, and 4 CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, for example. All of this is set in here. And by this point, you're saying to yourself, well, this is hard-coded. I'm going to have to fire this thing up and modify these anytime those standards change. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right, the way we've done it right here. And I chose to go this way really just for simplicity. Going into a production environment, you probably want to, well, we'll talk about some of those options here and how we can reach out later to make sure we set those and give us some flexibility. So now that we've made these changes, we're in our VCAC Designer. We'll click Send, and this will save the newest version of the building machine workflow back into the repository. And then we're ready to try it out. So we're going to attempt to provision from one of our blueprints that we added the size selected build profile to. On the left, you can see that our select size there shows us our drop-down list, small, medium, and large. I chose the large and provisioned it, and you can see that it was allocated with 4 CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, and a 20 gig hard drive. Even though on the left, the number of CPUs is still set to 1, 2 gigs of RAM, and just a 40 gig disk 0. So one of the pieces we want to talk about here is, what is this? Is this good? Is this bad? What needs to be done? And so on. So I kind of threw this in here, just kind of the pros and cons of it. The pros, really, of course, at this point, we're done. We've completed what we need to do to apply a standard size to all of our machines. We've made it very easy to turn on and off, and we're not having to reach out to other systems. I'm not having to use this workflow to call another workflow in Orchestrator or elsewhere. And as far as adding and setting new properties, let's say that I need to set the label on disk 1 based on the business group. Well, that's fairly straightforward and easy to do with what we've got here. The downsides, of course, are just what we talked about earlier. It's somewhat difficult and awkward then if my standards change. If suddenly my large is 6 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM instead of 4, I might not want to fire up the VCAC Designer to make that change. So we may want to later work with going from here and calling to a orchestrator workflow that will allow us to and then query some sort of SQL database and populate those values. We still have to come back in here and save them into the repository, but that would give us a little more flexibility for that option. You'll notice that one of the pieces I have on here as a con is it doesn't really work with linked clone blueprints, and this has to do with the fact that the linked clone, of course, is not really based on a template, The VMX for that is already set with for instance, the number of disks that are in it. So it really won't allow you to make those kind of changes. But it does work very well with the template full clones. So here's what we're talking about there. Yes, sir.
Brian, I think we might have a question from Victor Camacho. He's got his hand raised. Victor, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. All right, you should be unmuted now, at least from my side. Did you have a question?
I'm sorry, that was not intended. I'm multitasking. I apologize.
Unacceptable. Going down your permanent record.
Dang, it's gone over now.
Oh, man, I've been given the scarlet letter.
All right, just checking. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Sorry about that. We'll change that.
So here we are. We want to talk about how we would use this going into production, and this is what we want to do here: is kind of mitigate what we're having to do with some of the hard coding of the size configuration elements. Put those into a SQL database that would allow it to be queried from an orchestrator workflow. So we'll put together a workflow that says, when I tell you small, you tell me 110. When I tell you medium, you come back and say two CPUs, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 10 gig hard drive, or whatever the case may be. And then pop those back into the rest of the workflow that way. That gives us a little bit of flexibility if things were to change with our standards. So our second use case is somewhat easier, and we won't need the VCAC Designer to do what we're trying to do. But this one is also really common in the environments that we've stood up VCAC, and some of the solutions are around that. Again, we're trying to, the objective would be to try to limit the number of infrastructure as a service blueprints. The administrator may determine, hey, I really don't want to have to spin up a blueprint for every single network that a given business group could have access to. I want them to be able to choose, does this one go into the web network or the database network or the app network, whatever the case may be. I call this one, I said it was simple, really because what we've done with it is we've set the same list of networks for pretty much everybody who's going to consume that blueprint. And that's because the property that we're manipulating there is really the one property throughout the system. That looks something along these lines. So I've got depicted here a total of 6 networks. That's 3 web app and data for both the production and test environment, and 3 business groups. So all 3 web business groups can all see networks, can provision all 6 networks. And again, if I stand up just a reservation with 6 networks for each of the business groups, you found that by default it will just provision into a round-robin selection of the networks, and not necessarily where you want it to go, unless you modify the blueprint. So let's fix that. So we're going to make sure that we've configured our network profiles. In this case, we've defined them as app tier, data tier, and web tier. Again, this is for simplicity. I'd assume in your environment you'll have a great many more network profiles, but it'll make sense how you add those later. Each of these network profiles is going to be included on a drop-down list for the user. And before we get started there, we want to make sure that we update the reservation to include all the networks that business group will need access to. So in this particular case, I have a reservation for each business group that provides access to all 3 of the same networks. Of course, we can add additional ones, but those won't appear on the drop-down list unless I list them in the property attributes for the custom property. So again, our first step is going to be to create a property dictionary and the attributes for that. The property dictionary is going to be based on the virtual machine.network0.profile name property. Now that actually is one of those that is in the custom property reference guide from VMware. So the system already knows how to deal with that one. Any kind of handlers do anything special with it other than set that to a real network profile name. So again, we're going to choose the drop-down list control type. This again prevents the user from entering an arbitrary value and requires that they select only from one of those that we provide. We can select the items on that list. You can see it out here in the property attributes. We set the value list to data tier, app tier, web tier, and those become the 3 items that are available to the user. Again, if I have more networks or network profiles, and I've added those to the reservation for the user, I simply add those into the value there for the value list for this property dictionary. Just as before, we're going to add the property that we've set up, the custom property we've set up, to a build profile. I like to name this one something along the lines of select network, since we're going to let them select a network. And we're going to include, of course, the network0.profile name. We want to make sure that we set the prompt user option there to yes. This, of course, makes sure that the user has the opportunity to make a selection in there. If you happen to create a request layout, so if we have multiple properties and we want them to display in a particular order, that's where you would add the request layout as well. And again, we're going to update the infrastructure as a service blueprint by adding or checking the box beside the virtual machine.select network build profile. And this will allow us to provide the user with the drop-down list of networks. And here's how that appears. So when the user attempts to provision a machine from any one of the blueprints that includes the select network build profile, they'll be prompted to select a network, and the machine will be provisioned into that network because we've already made sure that we've included that on their reservation. Again, the pros and cons of this approach, it's done. We've already made those changes. There's no additional modifications to workflows. It's pretty easy at this point. The downside to it is it's the same network selection for everyone using that blueprint and build profile. If I were to add new networks and add new reservations, including those networks, I still have to modify my property dictionary attributes to include those new network names. So let's say that use case doesn't work for you and we need to go a little further with it. I have 3 business groups, and I trust one of them to provision to all 6 of my networks, no problem at all. The other business group, let's say we only trust them to, we'll let them provision to the test web and test app tier, and if everything works out for them, then we'll let them, the business group 1 may be able to modify the number, whatever the case may be. And then the third business group, I'm okay with them, but I don't want to trust them to do anything in the database tier, just for argument's sake. So in this case, we've got 3 different lists of networks, 1 for each of my business groups. Business group 1 has 6 networks, business group 2 has 3, business group 3 only has 2 networks that it can provision to. This is kind of the breakdown there, so you understand what I'm trying to say. Who can provision to which of them? Again, in your environment, you're probably going to have a lot more networks, maybe more business groups, and somewhat more complexity. But this is where I'm trying to illustrate with the what's available to which users. Be sure that you have your reservations set so that if we include a network profile on the drop-down list for a particular business group, that network profile is also included on the reservation for that business group. All right. Again, we're going to make sure that we've configured our network profiles. So we've got a handful of them defined here. You can see we've got a production web app and data, a test web app and data, and we've got them defined this way. We're going to make sure that we include those on the reservations. So again, for the particular business group, they've got the various networks assigned to them. You can see here I'm using NSX and virtual wires for this environment. But we're still presenting the network profile name with a pretty simple name so the user doesn't have to know what's going on in the background. Again, if we stop at this point, virtual machine would be provisioned round robin to one of those networks that is on the reservation for that business group. I mean, we want to make sure that we have a little more, quite a bit more control over which network is used for the provisioned machine. So again, we're going to go back to your property dictionaries. This time, we want to do something a little different. I want to create a property dictionary for each list of network profiles. And I'm going to make them a little different. So we're not going to use the predefined custom property network zero.profile name necessarily, because that one's really standard for everybody. But I want to make sure that I present a list to the user, and then behind the scenes we pop in the correct value. Behind the scenes meaning in the building machine workflow, we pop in that value into the correct custom property for the workflow. So here we've created a network selection property dictionary. All three of these are going to be drop-down lists, and they each have a different option there. So for example, this is for my network selection.testAll custom property, so the attribute there set to allow the user to choose each of the three test networks, web, app, and data. Again, just like before, they're comma delimited, and we'll have one for prod test and all, which will include 6, and then the test web and app, which only includes the test web and test app networks. In addition, we're going to create our build profile. We're going to create one again for each network list that we're going to have. In this particular case, we're going to make sure that we set the new custom property virtual machine.do network. We're going to set its value to true. Again, we're going to apply some logic in our workflow that says if the do network property is set to true, then of course we go and do something. If that value is not set or is set to something other than true, then we just bypass that piece of the logic. This allows us to have quite a bit more control over what's executed within that workflow. And then in this case, for this build profile, we've chosen to add the custom property for network selection.testAll. All right, and then again, we're going to update our infrastructure as a service blueprints and make sure that we choose the appropriate network for this particular business group, and excuse me, so we're going to create business group specific blueprints. Now this is going to increase the number of blueprints that we have in our environment, but that's not all that uncommon. This is just where we end up with business group specific instead of shared blueprints, and then we choose the appropriate build profile and therefore the appropriate network selection list based on that business group.
Hey Brian, I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Question is from Mike. His question is, why do you need property definitions if the different business groups are entitled to different groups of networks? If you had one list of all the networks, would the business group only be able to choose the ones they were entitled to?
So the list that appears to the user is generated based on the property definition and the items that we put in there. So the items that are on that list it doesn't query which ones you have access to or which ones are entitled or in the reservation for that business group. So it would be entirely possible for a business group to be presented a list of all 6 networks, but those 6 networks aren't necessarily included in that business group's reservation. And so if they were to choose one that they shouldn't have access to, the provisioning may fail, or may be in a situation where provisions where it should not.
Right. Yeah. So bottom line, as I understand it, entitlements are catalog items and actions only. They don't apply to things like reservations and network profiles, etc. Correct?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the entitlements are really with items that show up on the for the catalog items. What you're able to provision. The reservations determine what goes into the infrastructure as a service options. Right.
Right.
Your compute resources and your networks and so on.
So if somebody asks me how I just sounded smart, I'm going to tell them that I learned it from watching Brian.
Again, we're going to have to make some significant modifications to our building machine workflow. Again, we've got some logic here in place where we're going to look for the do network property. If it's true, then we retrieve the values based on which one is set, right? So if I select network property, I'm going to first look at the the property that's in the custom. We created 3 custom properties, one for each network list. So each of those custom properties we'll have to evaluate and see which one the user was presented and which selection they made from there. Rather than going through the 8 more slides of that, if you bear with me one moment, I will pull up kind of that workflow as I've got it. Let's see. Does this show up?
There's a delay. I'm still waiting to see it. But I do have another question. Yeah.
Yes.
That showed up briefly. It was just a quick view and then it went away. So the question is from Ashley Williams, and that is, can you invoke multiple VCO workflows via workflow stubs within the same lifecycle stage? For example, could you call 2 workflow IDs using the same machine building stage?
So yeah, certainly within the building machine workflow, we could sequentially call VCO workflows, and we could pass the parameters to it. So we'll call one, we'll return back to the building machine workflow, and then we can call another, with the same execution, but they'll be sequential. And then we can apply some logic around there. Again, if we could say, for instance, if the do network option is set, then go off and do something in Orchestrator.
Cool. Well, Ashley, if you have additional questions, just feel free to pop those into the chat. And by the way, I can see the VCAC Designer interface right now.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, so like I said, rather than iterating through a whole bunch more slides, I figured I would just pull up the workflow and what we've got in here for this work for dealing with the network selection. Again, so we're in the building machine workflow. We navigate into the custom code section. Again, we can see here's our do size that we had done before. So here's the logic remains intact for that one. And then we're going to add new logic then for the whoops.
Wow.
Sorry, that was loud.
Is that a dinosaur behind you?
Wow.
Like a Dinobot or something. That's crazy.
Was unexpected? Okay. All right, so the do network property is set. Excuse me, at this point what we've done is we've retrieved the do network machine property, and we're going to store it in the do network variable. By default, it's going to be false. In this case, we've passed it a value of true in that variable. And then we're going to look into our if-then, which of course says if it's true, then we're going to run the set network flow. If it's anything else, we're just going to bypass. So our set network workflow, this is where we have our, so I'll make this a little bit more real estate. Okay. So first we're going to retrieve the variables that we're talking about here. So I've got my network profile name, the select network value 1, 2, 3. This is to represent the 3 network selection lists that we created, do size and do network that we had before. Again, so we're going to retrieve the value here from the network selection test web app. If that one is set, then we're going to set our network 0.profile name to that value that we passed. So again, if the user had been presented with the they didn't work quite as well as I wanted it to. The selection of only test web and test app, and whatever network profile had been presented, they had made that selection, then we'll set that property here. The next option, if they had instead been presented with all of the test networks, that's the test web, test app, test data, we'll set that selection in that one. Once we finish setting the network0.profile name to the selected value, then we simply save those changes back to the repository, and then the provisioning proceeds. Let's see. Let me make sure I go back to the right thing here.
So a wee bit of trivia while we're waiting for the screen to swap. The reason why there's always a New Zealand phone number is because the vBrownbag uses a credit card from New Zealand. It did the business in New Zealand, so because Al lives there, Alistair Cook. So GoToWebinar, in its infinite, amazing short-sightedness, decided that only where that payment originates from is where you should show the phone number. So yeah, every single time I'm like, what is that silly vBrownbag number? Yeah. But anyhow, a little bit of trivia for you.
All right, is the preset showing now, Damien?
I see a black screen, so if that's it, then yes.
That's a negative, all right. Let's try that one more time.
There we go. You see the building machine workflow slide.
Awesome, all right. So this is what we went through. We went through the how we've built the building machine workflow to accommodate the various network selections and to set that property into the network0.profile name given the selection from the user. And then again, how this works for the user is they have their drop-down based on who they are, determines which list of networks is displayed to them, and then that value gets set for the given user. As you saw in the workflow, it does work in conjunction with the size selection. So if you want to give the user two choices, both the size and network, you can do so, and that works pretty well. Pros and cons again. With this particular one, it does work with linked clones because we're really not changing anything to do with the size or the configuration of the VMX. It again works with the size selection. You can make sure that you choose your build profiles. You can actually label those if you choose to for business groups, and it's easily bypassed. So if you have a situation where I really want to make sure that we're not doing this, or I've got a business group that really is only going to provision to a single network, then I simply set the new network property to true for that particular business group, and then that chunk of the log gets bypassed. Some of the cons to this particular one is if we have to add more lists of networks, not just networks, but if I need to add more lists of networks to it, for instance, we're bringing in a different business group, or we're adding another a combination of networks, or we've bridged something in, then in those kind of cases, we'll have to make a modification to the workflow that includes the logic to look for that custom property network selection. And just like before, there's really not a synchronization with the items that appear in the drop-down list, that is the value list for the custom property. There's no synchronization between that and the networks that are on the business group's reservation. And then, when you build a multi-machine blueprint, you typically select your component blueprint, and then you determine what network it's going to go into. So really, selecting a network at this point doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a multi-machine blueprint. So one of the workarounds we were thinking about there for it not being in synchronization would be to maybe do some advanced services where you are managing your network lists and property dictionaries based on the reservations. So you could do an orchestrator workflow to make that query and to update the update the property dictionary and attributes based on that information. So it will be possible to do your drop-down list as a service. And that's really all I have.
Cool. I've got another question here. Let's see. Actually, two questions. So the first one is from Ashley, and that is there a speaking would be a useful skill in life. Is there a WF stub that I can use that occurs before the building machine stage? For example, how would you set the host name custom property by concatenating values from provided input fields or drop-downs at the time of request? I know the answer to this one. It's a giant PETA, and I read a cool blog post about it, but I'll let you go for it.
So the building machine is kind of it's an interesting name because it fires really before the provisioning occurs, before the call is made out to vSphere, right? So there's a number of interesting articles. I've actually got a series on my little blog there dealing with how to set the machine name based on this sort of thing. And you do modify the building machine workflow stub. So in there is where you make your determination, right? So my business group name, for instance, may include some indicator, not just the prefix, but maybe some additional indicator of what the name should be, contribute to that name. In addition, based on the network selection, I want to include a W, A, or D in the machine name based on where it is in the network, or any of those properties. So you would make those changes and apply that logic within the building machine workflow stub. And then, of course, save that back to the repository, and then the provisioning will resume.
Excellent. And for those of you that aren't aware, and I didn't mention this at the top of the podcast, but Brian's website is brianragazzi.com. Also, amazingly creative naming there, buddy. I see you followed the old first name, last name. Yes. And he's got a lot of articles on there about VCAC, having the joy of working with it regularly at his day job. So Mike actually has a question relating to one of the previous points that you were talking about before Ashley's question, and that is there's no for each for the network lists in the workflow. Wouldn't that make the network list logic easier to maintain?
It really would. There's a number of limitations. Let's see if I can pull that back up again. With the logic that's in here, there is a for each control flow available to you, and that's something that you may be able to process a little easier. I did it this way, really, just for readability. This just sort of made sense, but absolutely, if this is something that you're familiar with, then iterating through the for each action instead makes perfect sense.
Cool, thank you. Are there any other questions? If so, feel free to raise your hand within the webinar interface or shoot me a question within previously mentioned webinar interface. Let's see, I'm not seeing any under the hashtag or directly toward our Twitter account. So I'm going to say no, we're good. Thank you very much, Brian. I absolutely appreciate your time, and I know that the community does too. If you do have questions for Brian, feel free to tweet him. He's at Brian Ragazzi. That's Ragazzi, or go visit his blog at brianragazzi.com. Do you have any closing comments, Brian?
It's really been a pleasure, Damien. It's always great talking to you, and I'm really honored to be able to help with this sort of thing, and I hope somebody gets something out of it. One quick item here is we'll make available the XAML file, which is kind of the export of the workflow, and then this is the quick what you do to actually import that back into your environment is what we got here.
Yeah, absolutely, and that should be posted at professionalvmware.com after the podcast has been converted and transmogrified and uploaded. So feel free to go there to view all the resources that Brian just mentioned. And that, I believe, is it for the evening. Give you folks back 10 minutes of your day. As always, thank you very much for your time. This has been Damien Carlson at 6 Foot Dad and Brian Ragazzi at Brian Ragazzi. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.